Hello, everyone, and thank you for participating in the Lytham Partners Summer 2022 Investor Conference. My name is Joe Diaz. I'm a managing partner at Lytham Partners. For this presentation, we welcome Science 37 Holdings, which trades on the Nasdaq exchange under the ticker symbol of SNCE. Representing the company today are David Coman, Chief Executive Officer, and Mike Zaranek, Chief Financial Officer. David and Mike will run through a slide presentation to provide you a thorough overview of the company and its prospects going forward. Before we begin, Lytham Partners is one of the country's leading investor relations firms. With more than 2 decades of corporate access experience, we have built one of the industry's most diverse and effective platforms for connecting small cap companies with high quality and focused institutional investors. We thank all of you for being here today. One final item before we begin. As a reminder, David and Mike will be available for one-on-one meetings later this week. If you have not already signed up, please visit the Lytham Partners website at lythampartners.com/virtual and click the one-on-one meeting request button. With that said, let me turn the proceedings over to David Coman, CEO of Science 37 Holdings. David, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Joe. Thanks. Really appreciate you having us today. I'm happy to share the Science 37 story. I'll start with some key highlights about Science 37. Broad perspective, we're disrupting a very large industry. We count about $220 billion. It's the clinical research industry. We're enrolling patients significantly faster than what is traditionally done in a clinical trial. We're engaging patients longer, and we're getting a much more representative patient population. We have the operating system that we think is defining the category for the future. That includes a technology platform that enables all the workflow and capability to operationalize a clinical trial, plus all the specialized networks that we put on top of them in order to be able to execute. Our financial performance has been outstanding. In terms of the first quarter, significant bookings and revenue growth quarter over quarter, and we continue to see a world into the future where there is significant growth opportunities for us to continue to expand as we grow into 2022 and beyond. So just starting out, I think it's helpful to have an idea of the clinical research industry in its broadest sense. And so, just think about the way clinical research has been done. It's really been done about the same way for the last 60 to 90 years. A clinical trial sponsor, this is a pharmaceutical company, will set up a network of hospitals, clinics around the world. We call them sites. Each of those sites have their own people, processes, and technology. That could be coordinators and nurses and investigators at each of those individual sites. And in order to make sure that all those sites are consistent, they hire contract research associates to fly around the world, door to door, to make sure all the processes are being followed, all the patients are being matriculated into the study. But the reality of this process is that we're getting extraordinarily limited participation. Only about 3% of providers today participate as a clinical trial investigator, and only 8% of patients participate. And that's an aggregate number. Across all studies, only about 8% of patients are being approached about joining a clinical trial. Execution is extraordinarily slow and inefficient. The average startup time to get a study going with that whole site network takes about 31 weeks. And 80% of clinical trials are delayed as a result, mostly from patient recruitment. Once you recruit the patients, then the enrollment rates or the retention rates are extraordinarily low. So you have a high dropout rate for those patients matriculating for the full trial. And non-white representation is only about 14%, which isn't just a social issue. It's actually a clinical issue when you think about taking the drug into market for the patients who are actually going to be taking that drug. Having less representation is a very large industry issue. So the Science 37 solution is really to create a much more agile design where we have the ability to recruit anyone, anywhere, beyond that 8% of the total patient population that gets approached today. So we can engage them from the comfort of their own home. We can engage them, send them to local point of care centers in order to get procedures done. We can connect them to telemedicine investigators who will manage those patients remotely. Or we also have the ability to manage those patients at a traditional clinical trial sites, particularly when you're talking about key opinion leader sites that you want to engage in a clinical trial. Ultimately, we're seeing an extraordinary difference between a traditional model and the Science 37 model. And when it comes down to it, we really have the ability to reach just about any patient anywhere, both providers on one side, patients on the other, ultimately accelerating those timelines exceptionally fast. I'm going to go into this in a second. We're talking about a 12-week startup versus 31.4 weeks on average for a traditional model. The recruitment and enrollment process is up to 21 times faster. And when we talk about retention and representation, 96% of our patients follow through the entire clinical study, and we have 3 times the diversity in our clinical trials. Now, how? In the traditional trial method, you're really relying on traditional clinical trial sites to go find those patients. And that's why less than 8% of the total patient population enrolls. When Science 37 engages on a clinical trial, we're engaging patients no matter where they are, which gives us the ability to get up to 100% of the total patient population. And we're not launching one site at a time to go find those patients. We're enrolling an entire country at the same time. Again, as I said before in the last page, up to 21 times faster in terms of patient enrollment and 3 times the diversity. Now, if you just juxtapose a traditional site to a Science 37, traditional study to a Science 37 study, it looks like this. You start with, in the green, for us, we have to do a platform build and we go through operational readiness. In a traditional, that's the first green bars on the chart. When you talk about a traditional clinical trial, you have to go through site identification, then site feasibility, then site contracting, then site training, and site initiation. All that takes that 31.4 weeks that I just talked about before. So just out of the gate, we're talking about a huge time savings. And then when you talk about the enrollment rate, this is the blue, dark blue section of your slide, up to 21 times faster. Now, the illustration here for a phase 3 trial, we're talking about a 9 to 12 month enrollment period. Now, a similar trial in a traditional trial method, we're talking about 12 to 18 months. All of that ultimately to start collecting the data. Now, just think about what that means. From a timeline, startup timeline, 3 to 4 months, and an enrollment timeline of 3 to 6 months, both, shorter. It ultimately equates to about 6 to 10 months of savings. Now, if you take savings and you turn that into opportunity costs in the clinical trial market, what we're really talking about is this. The average study burns about $3.3 million a month in its startup process. The average drug at peak commercialization generates about $16.7 million of revenue. Those two combined are $20 million. So we're really talking about doing with this extraordinary savings in time, it ultimately brings it to cost savings between $120 million and $200 million of cost savings on a trial that may cost $20 million for us to execute. Huge in terms of time savings. And we do all this through our operating system. Now, many people call what we do decentralized clinical research, but the reality of what we're really doing is we're centralizing all the people, the processes, and technology. So we have one technology platform that enables the workflow orchestration, the evidence generation, and the data harmonization. We standardize all of the processes and initiate patients through patient communities. We have telemedicine investigators, community providers that we're activating, mobile nurses that go directly to the patient's home, remote coordinators who orchestrate all the activities, and device and data that integrates into the platform itself. Now, let's just translate this into reality. So a study run by Science 37 will find the patient, through social media. It could be through a pharmacy network. It could be through labs. It could be through the community providers. But many of those patients, when they come to Science 37, really need to understand what they're going to get involved in. And so we make it extraordinarily easy for them to understand what to expect during a clinical trial. Now, the initiation of a patient into a trial starts with what we call the informed consent. And so this is usually a piece of paper that the patient signs at the individual site. For us, we have a very app-easy way in order for them to do that. And so they'll download the Science 37 app. It takes them through the informed consent process, and we can have someone working with them in the background to explain everything. We also can embed instructional videos in it. We can ask questions within the informed consent itself. And then ultimately it gets down to entering your name and entering your signature and pressing submit. And once that patient hits the submit button, that's registered into our platform immediately. It's not like you're taking a piece of paper and scanning it and putting it to another system, or having a human taking a signature and then recreating that into another system and then checking for all those audit trails later. For us, it's all embedded in one source. Now, this is the initiation of a patient. On the other side, of course, is the investigator. And the investigator has their own platform that they're working with every day. And what you can see in front of you is, in this case, a series of assessments that need to be taken or procedures that need to be done on any individual visit. You just saw visit 1, this is visit 2, and so on and so forth as it goes down to the bottom. It goes up to 13 visits in this trial. Now, what we're doing is we're laying this out so every patient has his or her unique journey, and every investigator, coordinator, and nurse can follow that patient along that journey wherever they are. And there's no ambiguity as to where that patient is. And the important thing to do is to juxtapose this to a traditional trial where a sponsor or a clinical research organization may send a piece of paper to the individual site to say, these are the things that you need to do. And those individual sites need to translate that into their own systems. For Science 37, every single patient, investigator, nurse, coordinator are all on the same page utilizing the technology platform. Now, it gets to the practical reality of a visit itself between a patient, investigator, nurse. Coordinator will help set it all up. And so what you're seeing here is the coordinator view. You can see the coordinator scheduling, and they'll state the time, the day, who are the participants, the investigator, the patient, the nurse, any special instructions. Once that coordinator hits the submit button, all the apps are updated immediately. So everybody knows exactly where they need to be, what they need to do. And it gets to the visit itself. And then you can see the investigator on the left-hand side, the patient on the right-hand side. And the investigator in this case is initiating the visit. You can see the investigator on the left-hand side, but more importantly, the patient on the right-hand side can see that investigator into their phone. You could also see, the investigator can also see the patient, and you can see the nurse behind that patient. All those are triangulating care in the comfort of that patient's own home. You can see sort of the center of the page, that investigator going through the workflow of that individual visit. These are called clinical outcome assessments that they're capturing real time with that patient. You can see green check marks going as the patient matriculates along that clinical trial process. Now, the investigator ended the call here, and the nurse is still with that patient. And so we'll take you into the patient nurse flow. And that nurse is staying behind to be able to collect vital signs. In this case, you'll click into it. You can see all the data being captured about that patient's vital signs. They're administering what we call IMP, investigational product. In this case, it's an injection. So which arm, how many milliliters, what lot number, and then ultimately inspecting the incision or the injection site. So you have all that data captured within one platform, depicting all the information that's needed throughout the trial, and the patient continues to matriculate along the process and the journey. All the data is being captured, the patient screening data, the endpoint data, connected device data, operational data, EMR, EHR data is all being logged into one system under a standardized data model, one repository. We have APIs that connect into other systems if we need to port data in or out of the platform, and we can tokenize data for long-term follow-up. It's important to note here, versus a traditional clinical trial where every single site has their own processes and their own data capture systems and their own methodology for doing it, everything's centralized. All that data is being inputted into one system. And so there's no ambiguity as to where you are at the end of the trial. Now, when we go to market in 3 different ways. The first of which is utilize the Science 37 technology platform. We're orchestrating all the activities, and we're the sole provider. So this is a full agile clinical trial that Science 37 is running on behalf of a sponsor. Second way we go to market is through what we call a meta site, or just think about this as one virtual site that you may have in a traditional clinical trial site network. So you'll set up a network of sites around the world. You get to maybe 1% of the population, and then Science 37 comes in to get the 99% of the rest of the population. And then the last one is technology or tech plus, and this means We can configure the technology however you need for the boundaries of that clinical trial. And we could also add those network configurations like the patient recruitment, like our coordinators, nursing, investigators, et cetera. But by having this level of flexibility, it enables Science 37 to be applicable to just about any indication and about any phase in a clinical trial. Now, just think about the competitive set for Science 37. There's really two types of competitive axes that we work with. The first of which is the trial orchestration competitive set. The second one is a technology competitive set. Now, when we talk about the orchestration competitive set, what we're talking about, the pinnacle of that really is contract research associations or organizations. The reality of contract research organizations, what they're really good at is identifying the right sites, doing the feasibility across those sites, doing the contracting with those sites, doing the training, doing the initiation and the management of those sites. Doing what we do is completely different. And so it's working directly with the patient. It's managing those patients as they matriculate along the study. The reality is, though, because of the success that we've had with this model, more CROs need to have these capabilities in-house, but don't have the fundamental core capabilities to be able to execute. This is where Science 37 is really becoming the operating system that is enabling CROs to be able to execute decentralization. And we see the CRO industry standardizing on the Science 37 solution. The other axis, as I said, are technology providers. And the reality of the technology providers that are out there, almost all of them are individual point solutions that are purporting to be able to manage components of what they call decentralization. The reality is they're point solutions. Science 37 platform has everything that you need in order to be able to execute a fully decentralized clinical trial. There's others out there, as you go further to the right, who talk about themselves as being decentralized clinical trial technology solutions. So they don't have the ability to actually orchestrate anything. They're actually enabling the technology. And on the back end of it, the core distinction between us relative to some of the other competitors that are trying to be fully decentralized is the workflow that sits on top of our system to enable all those different piece parts to happen along the continuum of the clinical trial. Now, the fact that we are also orchestrating the trials ourselves, we get the quantitative and we get the qualitative data in at the same time, which gives Science 37 a really strong long-term competitive moat relative to any of the other players. And today, really the only company of size that have an operating system to enable both the technology and the networks in order to be able to deliver. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mike Zaranek, who will talk a little bit about our financial performance and close us out.
Thanks, David. And as you heard from David's opening remarks, there are a lot of secular trends that are very positive for Science 37, and we've been able to capitalize on a number of those. And so I'm going to walk through some of our first quarter financial performance achievements. On the left side of the page, you can see our revenue grew about 50% year over year from the first quarter of 2021 to the first quarter of 2022. Now, for those of you who have followed the story and listened to our first quarter earnings call, as well as our fourth quarter earnings call of 2021, you will have heard that by virtue of some of the performance accelerators that we were able to achieve through some of the operating system elements that David spoke about, we actually were able to pull forward and accelerate about $2.3 million that we originally had contemplated coming in the first quarter of 2022. We actually pulled that forward and brought that into the fourth quarter of 2021. It was good for patients, it was good for our customers, and it was good for us in the fourth quarter. But obviously we had an impact here in the first quarter from bringing that revenue forward. As you've heard from David, there are a number of compelling arguments as to why our customers would look to utilize Science 37 and the solution sets we can bring. And off to the top right, you can start to see some of the financial measures by which we are able to demonstrate that. Working from top to bottom, in terms of net bookings, we achieved almost $31 million of net bookings here in the first quarter. Now, as noted in the footnote there, and as some of you may have heard on our fourth quarter of 2021 earnings call and our first quarter of 2022 earnings call, we did have two large COVID cancellations that impacted us in the first quarter. Absent those two cancellations, we had our second highest quarter ever from a gross bookings perspective. But from a net bookings perspective, so net of the cancellations, we produced almost $31 million of net bookings in the first quarter. Now, I think if you look at a specific quarter, you're going to see some volatility potentially in our results given our current size. But if you expand that over a wider time horizon, you can start to see some of the momentum that we've been able to build in the business. And you're seeing that in the trailing 12 months net bookings there in the row highlighted in green. For the last 12 months ending, the first quarter of 2022, we had almost $154 million of bookings. And by bookings, these are as contracted. So it's not speculative. These are opportunities that we bid on, that we've won, and that we've contracted for. That trailing 12-month total bookings number was up 61% year over year. A lot of momentum in the business. Additionally, if you look at our backlog, and this represents the as contracted amount of awards that have not yet been performed. We exited the first quarter with nearly $176 million in our backlog. That is up 100% year over year. So the net bookings feed into the backlog to the extent that they're not burning revenues in the particular period. And from a backlog perspective, up 100% year over year, really strong from that standpoint. From a guidance standpoint, we have reiterated the guidance that we had originally provided in our fourth quarter 2021 earnings call. We reiterated that in the Q1 earnings call for 2022 at a total of $86 million to $96 million in total revenues. And that compares to a 2021 year where we generated just under $60 million of total revenues. From an adjusted EBITDA perspective, we have looked at the business, have continued to make significant investments around technology, around our go-to-market strategy, as well as our delivery and execution arm. And we believe that we are going to deliver between negative $65 million to negative $69 million of adjusted EBITDA on a full year basis for 2022. So off to a really strong start here in the first quarter. Now I'd like to turn it back over to David to wrap things up.
I think in summary, you're looking at a very large industry that we're penetrating. We're executing extraordinarily well. We have an operating system that we believe is going to be the operating system the industry standardizes. And then on the financial performance has been outstanding. Our growth quarter over quarter has been very strong, and we believe that the future is also very strong for Science 37 as we continue to expand and make Science 37 the operating system for the future. So with that, I'll close our formal comments and Joe, see if you have any other additional questions.
Well, given the momentum and the traction that you're experiencing in the business here in the last handful of quarters, what are the drivers of this performance, and how do you see that working its way throughout 2022?
Yeah, I think the drivers are about proof. I think that if you take a look back historically to, let's call it 2019, I think this was seen as being experimental. So most of the awards that we had were, from innovation units within pharma companies. I think in 2020, you saw a change where, COVID hit and there was some panicking in the industry and kind of looking for a way to systemically keep a patient and provider relationship together. So I think that was very strong. I think as you moved into 2020, despite the fact that all the sites were open around the world, what you saw was actually results. And I think that the results surprised the industry. And we were able to continue to drive extraordinary growth as we went into 2021. And as 2022 continues, you can see a lot of sentiment data that is, out in the market. We have a study that we recently did that shows that sponsors are more likely now to execute a hybrid version of a clinical trial where you would have traditional and decentralized, working in tandem together. And so I think that's really what is fueling the growth for the future. And I think that's because of the results that people have seen. And the numbers that we provided aren't hard hyperbole. They're real performance data. And the ability to go find not just patients faster, but the right kind of patients faster is even more important today, given the FDA's recent guidance that is now requiring the proper distribution of ethnic profiles and the clinical trial data that's being presented to match the commercial data that's being used in consumption. And I think that's also a very important point that's going to continue to propel us into the future.
That was going to be my next question. How does that impact your business? What is the advantage that you bring to the table in that regard?
Yeah, so if you go back to that, one of the slides here, that I won't waste our time doing that, but we showed you the full world population and we distinguished 8% versus 100%. The reality of where traditional clinical trial sites are located, they're typically around very Caucasian neighborhoods. And so there's an automatic bias in the site-based network that applies to every clinical trial. One of the studies I cited previously, about 86% of trial participants are Caucasian over the last several years. 86% doesn't even come close to representing the real population. And so if you don't have the bias of location and you have the ability to reach anyone anywhere, your results are going to look like anyone anywhere. And if you take a look at the cross-section of all the patients that we've been able to recruit in our clinical trials, it looks like the real population. It's no surprise because we don't have exclusion bias in the way we perform. I would actually extend it even a little bit further, Joe.
Sure. Just
think about a world today where that you can execute a clinical trial and anyone can participate in it. I've got some family background where someone in my family had ALS and came to me many years ago and asked whether or not they could participate in a clinical trial. And I said, sure. We looked him up. There wasn't anything anywhere near him. And he doesn't have the mobility to be able to go anywhere. But today, he's no longer with us. And if you're talking about a world when you have the ability to connect anyone anywhere into a clinical trial, I think that there's not just a moral obligation, not just a scientific obligation, but also an ethical obligation. So I think we're also filling an important gap there too.
Well, we've come to the end of our time here. I have to say this is a very exciting time in your company, and you're really bringing a lot of disruption that can only help. So we're excited to hear from you. We thank you very much for your time. David and Mike, thank you. We greatly appreciate that. And for anyone out there that has not already signed up to have one-on-ones with Science 37, again, please visit the Lytham Partners website at lythampartners.com/virtual and click the one-on-one meeting request button. Gentlemen, thanks for your time. And for everyone in the audience, we appreciate it and hope you have a great day. Take care.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.